Hello, everyone. Welcome to Where I Belong podcast. Today we have with us Josh from Josh Read Books. He's a history and fantasy reader, and he has his own podcast called Compendium. So, thank you, Josh, for joining us with today. And first of all, congratulations for reaching 50K followers on Instagram.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
I want to ask you about. I want to bring the Winston Churchill quote, winners write the history. And I also want to add another point to that. It is that history is also written by the people who has access to the publications and mass media. So coming to the point, during British Raj, because of Winston Churchill's deliberate policies and decisions, he caused Bengal famine where almost 3 million people died. But if we look back from 2 days, it is kind of like deliberate genocide he caused, and also there are um, remarks he passed why he did not choose to feed Bengal people. How do you see him? He is he a hero or a war criminal?
Man, Winston Churchill is a fascinating character in a lot of ways. So right now I'm working on a Civil War narrative series of shows, and Winston Churchill wrote a history where he also includes the Civil War in it. And just it's a microcosm of what you do with Winston Churchill because he's polarizing pretty much no matter which way you talk about him. And I try to, and I'll get to a point here in a second, but I always try to talk about historical figures in the context of their time and try and see them as best I can in an unbiased sort of a way. And Churchill is very difficult to do that with because he is, on the one hand, one of your World War II heroes. And I think some people could make the argument that he's integral to the Allies, prevailing against the Germans and the Japanese. But at the same time, he also has these horrific black spots on his resume as well. And I think you can even make arguments within the World War II elements there, like maybe he was not as great of a figure as we prop him up to be. Some people would argue that he was every bit the hero that, some of his biographers would say he is. He's interesting, though, because he's born in the 1800s. Part of this whole Civil War thing is trying to just reckon with the 1800s as a century. And some of the things that people are thinking and saying are horrific by modern standards. So, and there's a saying, and I can't remember who said it, but if you were to go back into a time machine and go hang out in the 1870s, the people that you would be having conversations with would not be your friends because you would be bringing your modern sensibilities to these conversations, and the things that would be said would be highly offensive because it's an incredibly racist century. And I would argue it's one of the most racist centuries in world history. So Winston Churchill is born in that period, and he's raised in a period where racism, like extreme bigotry and racism, is the norm. And so what do you do with a figure like that just views people that are different than him as naturally inferior, which is, again, super offensive by modern standards. But then he also lives long enough to see his views, the things that he was raised in, become outdated. And so he kind of becomes this like fossil of an old time. And he also stays in politics until he's really old. And so you have this guy that thinks things that are offensive and also acts in a way that's kind of outdated at times. But at the same time, he does a lot of things that you would consider somewhat heroic. So I would be hesitant to say he's a hero, but I would also be hesitant to say he's a villain. And that's a very difficult thing to say because you're taking it, the good with the bad. And like, how do you weigh those things? I don't know. I don't know where you put him on a scale. I think if you were to read some of the things he wrote, you'd come away thinking this guy is horrendous. This is a terrible individual. And I think in some ways you can make fantastic arguments to that point. And, like you mentioned, he is maybe the chief cause of the Bengal famine, which is terrible. That's as bad as you're going to get for a political leader. So there's a lot of black marks on his resume. I don't feel like I'm qualified enough to say this guy, I don't know. I don't know what you do with a person like that, but I tend to try and put him in the context of his time and just see how does that change things? And I think for him, he's an incredibly difficult figure to place in a box because I think if you place him in a box, you're eliminating half of what he was in either direction. I think if he's a hero, you're excluding some of the things he did that were terrible. If you just label him a villain, you're also going to exclude some of the things he did that were exceptional. So he's difficult naturally.
Yeah. As a Indian, so it is kind of difficult for me to accept him as a hero. So maybe probably European people will think of him in a different way. So in one of Ryan Holiday's book, he mentioned that okay, he has done some stuff in India and other parts of Kenya and all, but he felt sorry about it. But someone who is born and brought up in India, so it is kind of very difficult to empathize with him. So it's kind of like saying that okay, someone can do stuff, and if they feel sorry about it, you should forgive him. I mean, that is kind of like, as you mentioned, so he is very difficult to put him in a box. Either it is this or that way. So rather than like, we should see him more or less like a person like who has done some heroic things, and also there is so much of gray shade towards to his character.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the people too. If you are having a Churchill conversation, it's going to depend on who you talk to. Because you did mention, Europeans probably view him a certain way. Indians obviously would view him a different way, and neither way is wrong. I think for those people because they're viewing him through the prism that they've got, and so an Indian person's prism is going to naturally be very, very different, and they're going to be closer to the effects of the bad. They're maybe going to have witnessed some of the effects of the bad. And so their opinion of him is going to be reflected in that. Whereas the Europeans are probably going to be a lot closer to the effects of the good. They're going to say, we're not speaking German right now. And Winston Churchill might have a lot to do with that. But they also are not close to, there's a good chance they haven't gone on vacation in India. So they haven't gotten the chance to have conversations and sort of view him as a full picture.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of divisive people like that. And I think the thing that you'll find is with individuals like that have both done some good things and bad things, the further you get away in history on a timeline from the bad, you start to view them more in the positive. Genghis Khan is a great example. I mean, he is renowned for they killed millions of people.
Yeah.
But there's this revisionism about the Mongols in the past 15, 20 years, maybe, where historians now look at them and say, well, oh, look, there's all these good things that they did too. They organized and they governed in a very unique way. They did a lot of things that benefited humanity. You can say that in air quotes. But at the same time, they also massacred millions of people. So because we're not in the 1,000 years removed, we can view them in a different light. But if you were to go back 500 years, the way people talked about the Mongols was that they were the scourge of the devil.
Yeah.
It changes with the benefit of time.
When I was asking ChatGPT about it, so he's a hero or war criminal. So it mentioned one point to the Britain or to the Europeans. So he is the one who saved from fascism. Like the part of it is that Germany, when so it want like other parts of the European countries. Winston Churchill, with his policies and with his leadership, he kind of stopped the from that happening. So speaking of fascism, I read in one of, I think you are familiar with Thomas Sowell. He's an influential thinker. So in his book called White Liberals and Black Rednecks, he mentioned that why Jews are prosecuted in Europe. He mentioned one theory called middleman minorities, where if so middleman minorities, like to simply put it, it is that they're kind of like act as transactions between two groups. So let's say that someone is producing, another one wants to buy, so they act as the middleman. So to the people who are in German, who are kind of like has these racist ideas, they thought that okay, Jews are not doing anything much productive, so they are just acting as a like middleman. They are taking so much of wealth with them, so they are not doing anything. So it's not just Jews in Europe; it also happened with Indians in Uganda. So where I think after 1970s, where the government changed, then Indians were kicked out of Uganda, and also it also happened in India, South India, where chitinads were supposed to be where they are traders and middlemen. So the question that I want to ask is that uh, how easy it is to come up with the idea of like us versus them, just because that you are not able to get that something.
Yeah, the concept of us versus them. I mean, yeah, like you see that all throughout history, right? Anytime there's any sort of a difference between different people groups, it turns into a we are this way and we like how we are, and we perceive differences, and therefore you are other, you are less than, you are, fill in the blank. And it's funny, it manifests in a lot of different ways. Like the Greeks thought the Persians were, opulent and disgusting and perverted and all these things. The American South before the Civil War thought that the North was prudish. And the Mongols thought the Chinese were the same way that the Greeks thought the Persians were, that they were opulent and perverted and lazy. And you see this all throughout time. There's always, and you see this too, especially in war. War is obviously an extension of political thought, but more often than not, in order to make war, governments or leaders or whoever will need to generate support. And so the way they do that is they paint the enemy as some sort of perversion of the way they are. And this has changed a little bit with in modernity, but oftentimes, I mean, the Romans think the Gauls are, backwoods hicks almost, and then the Gauls, everybody sort of views their opponent through the lens of we are great and we are civilized and our way of life is the best, and the enemy is somehow lesser than. And you almost have to do that in order to go fight them and kill them. When I was working on the Vietnam shows on Compendium, one of the things you come across in a lot of memoirs is that there's this intentional dehumanization of Vietnamese on American bases in boot camp before they go and are deployed. So all these Americans, way they speak of Vietnamese, like the sergeants and the NCOs to these new recruits, the way they speak of them is they create this ability for you to think of the Vietnamese as inhuman or less than human, so that when you have to go kill them, it's not that hard because you just naturally think of them as somehow less than. And it's kind of a microcosm of war, for millennia. There's always some sort of a political action in order to make it easier to go kill them. And sometimes it's that simple. Sometimes it's more complicated than that. But you do see this kind of common thing where humans tend to place people differently than themselves into boxes, and it creates this dehumanization complex. And it can spread across cultures. It can be specific to certain groups of people, but you wonder how racism has gotten the way it's gotten. It's like a broad extension of some of these things that we've been doing to each other since the dawn of time.
Yeah, in the same book, White Liberals and Black Rednecks, Thomas Hall also came up with the theory that why blacks commit more crime and why blacks are more unproductive. So he came up with theory that in 17th 18th century, so some parts of North UK are like British, so Irish people came and they kind of settled in south of America, so where they were have these traits, so typical redneck traits they have. So once the slavery is abolished, they immediately the black people picked up the culture, so which is very close to them. I mean, not in terms of culturally, like personality or preference wise, it's more because of location or region wise. So with and the behavior that we see with the blacks after the slavery abolition, and and behavior of rednecks, they are kind of quite similar. And how do you see them? Like, do you agree with the theory, or do you have like I mean, it's too simplistic view. I know there is so much of complications, and also some side we need to be more insightful about it. Then my point is that, like, how do you see, like, do you subscribe to this theory, or like do you view it more differently?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
So there's a lot, and I'm still working through this, trying to figure this out. It's difficult because you've got the slavery piece, and then you remove the slavery piece and the way that whites and blacks interacted post abolition, let's say, it is like you have this built up racism that is intense. And I was reading in, I think it was a Bruce Catton book, but he was writing about how whites viewed their slaves as, you know, like they're cute and they're easy to compartmentalize because they're a slave and they have their place. And it's almost like the cute family cow. Again, disgusting, but you know, it's very easy to see them in that light as a slave. But then once they are a freed person, and you have to actually recognize that they are a human being, and it creates this natural pushback from whites. And so when you have Irish come in there and, you know, Germans and Dutch and, you know, all these immigrants that flood into the Americas, not only do you have this racism towards blacks, but you also have this racism towards everybody that's not, you know, a naturalized American. So, you know, the South especially, it views the North as a lot of different things, but it views them as not fully American. And so, you know, the South has this very insulated view of like, you know, we are the direct inheritors of, you know, the Cavaliers, the royalty of England. So it's this aristocracy, and they're very proud of that heritage. And many Southerners are still proud of that same heritage. But when you have to reckon with, not only are you then taking the family cow and now you have to view them as a human being with inalienable rights, and you have to treat them as another human being, there's pushback to that, but there's also pushback to the Irish, the Dutch, the Germans, and you know they are whites, so they have like this natural standing above a slave, but they're still other and they're still different than, and so it's very, very convoluted. And so, you know, you have this common thing that said before slaves are freed is that there's this idea that even very poor whites, so maybe an Irish immigrant or whoever, very poor whites that are not slaves, but they're very low on the totem pole, they there was this idea that they would consider themselves blessed that they were not slaves, that they were in a social position above them, even though they had no benefits of the society that they were living in. And so it's this very weird thing where you have poor whites that hate freed slaves. You've also got this this aristocratic group that also feels prejudice against freed blacks when they're freed. So I don't know. It's this weird melting pot where everybody kind of hates everybody else, and your identity is incredibly important. Your racial identity is incredibly important to each different group of people. Germans and Irish and Dutch, like they don't really like each other either. So it's it's not necessarily as simple as, you know, whites hate blacks. It's Protestants hate Catholics, Catholics hate Protestants, Irish hate Germans, Germans hate Dutch, and it kind of just keeps on going. So it's this very convoluted thing where it's not a very united group post Civil War and into the Reconstruction era. So it's very, very messy.
In the same book, you also mentioned that so blacks were like actually doing good after the slavery abolition, and so they were picking up themselves, and they are like started to have families, and they are kind of getting educated and everything. So once Democratic Party saw them as a tool where they can use to win the election, so from there the downfall has started. So do you agree with it, or do you have any other thoughts regarding that?
I'm not sure. That one's a little bit out of my realm of, I guess, quote unquote expertise, but you know, I'm not sure. You've got Jim Crow era that goes, you know, through the 1900s. I don't know. It sounds vaguely correct. I'm not sure the details specifically, but I would have to say I'd be practicing history without a license, to borrow a phrase from somebody else, if I went in there.
He presented so many facts in a way, like he came up with so much stats, like how blacks were doing in 90s, 10s and 1920s, and how they are doing after 1960s and 1950s. It is very elaborate, and like it kind of makes you agree with what he is saying. I mean, like until and unless you read the counterpoint and you strike a balance, it's not optimal way to subscribe to one views. And I feel that is true for every history book. So I mean, coming to that point, like India was ruled by so many empires, be it Mughal, British, and so the history that we learn in our schools, it's mostly about British Raj and Mughal, and we are often presented as someone who are very weak, who cannot fight back, who just accepted the invasions and everything. But if we look at history, we see so many cases where we fought back and we won. But the popular narrative that we followed, like all the years after the independence, so it is kind of presented us Indians as someone who are weak and who cannot fight back and protest. So how do you see that? And how do you see these narratives, and like and whoever has power, whoever has access to media or like publications, and who has power to influence people, they can make their narrative stronger. How do you think that we should have that ability to critical think?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of, the British, for example, if you were to take, Britain and India and paint it as sort of a binary thing where the British are the strong and the Indians are the weak, it doesn't paint the whole picture to say it that way. But if you want to simplify it, I suppose that is a way to simplify it. But that, again, it doesn't really tell you the full story of what is happening. I mean, the British, when they do, come in and colonize India, it's this period of, hyper colonization from all of these European powers. And so they're jumping in wherever they can. And Britain is the strongest of them. They have an incredible navy and they're very, very powerful. So, in fact, I think when they get into India and, everybody's getting in Africa and everywhere else, that might have been the peak of Britain's powers as an empire. So, if you want to paint it as they are very, very strong and India's very, very weak, I don't even know if that's the right way to do it. It might just be Britain was top dog on the, geopolitical food chain and India just wasn't top dog. And therefore, I mean, they could have been 10th. They might have been 8th, 15th, 20th, whatever. You can go down a list, but they weren't number one. And therefore, Britain came in and did what they did. The strong versus the weak, and also strong and weak doesn't necessarily paint the correct picture of everything as well, because it's what are we using to describe strength or weakness. Are we looking at economic power? Are we looking at production capabilities? Going back to Vietnam, when the Americans are in there, when the French are in there before the Americans, if you were going to list all the things that would make a great power, Vietnam is very, very low scoring in all of these things. And America is top dog. They are the number one superpower in the world in the 1960s and 70s. And so, and when you read all the sources, everybody says there's no chance America possibly loses this conflict. But there was a way they lost, and it didn't have anything to do with strength. It had everything to do with strategy and an ability to sort of outlast an opponent. And I think, sometimes the strongest wins. Sometimes the strongest doesn't win. When the Greeks fight the Persians are the foremost empire in the world. And yet the Greeks have the Athenians have a fantastic navy, and they defeat the Persians, and then they also defeat them on a land battle immediately afterwards. So you have a moment when the weaker power eventually defeats the superpower. So it's very difficult to say, strong always beats weak, because it doesn't. Sometimes you run up in a situation where it's just as simple as, maybe in the case of India, Britain was just a superpower, and in a period when everybody was taking advantage of what they saw as easy pickings geopolitically, India at that moment in time might have been ripe for the taking for Britain. But if somebody else came in, would they have been as successful? Probably not, because Britain, I think, was uniquely positioned to be able to do what they did. As I think it's Thucydides said, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. Sometimes, essentially, things happen and they're terrible, and it just kind of is what it is.
Problem that I see is that people, when they read books or what they have been taught in school or college, they just blindly accept that narrative. So it just, I feel like people should read from both perspectives. Like, I mean, as much perspectives they can. So, and they can come with their own conclusions. Okay, this is what happened, and this is what I think about it. The way I see it is that people rarely question the narrative; they just blindly accept it. It works for the uh, it works for the person who created the narrative in a way that they are kind of like supporting that narrative. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, narratives are, well, they change frequently. And there are a lot of things that you're taught in school that it's just not the full story. That's probably why I started Compendium in the first place, was because there's so many narratives in history that you get taught a very one note version of them in school. And it just naturally can't tell the full story. And when you learn the full story, you come away a lot of times not seeing things in black and white, but in shades of gray, because things get really complicated when you study the full story. And so, you know, a lot of the things that we've learned them in black and white, but really the way they happened, it's some shade of gray, and it gets really complicated that way.
Yeah. So we will talk something nice. Do you have any favorite periods of history that you are most interested in, or that you find not necessarily beautiful, but something that you thought like really good?
Yeah, I mean, I think the very simple and short answer is whatever I'm working on for Compendium right now. I tend to get very, very into that period. So right now, I am very into Civil War stuff right now, American Civil War stuff. But broadly speaking, I really love ancient Greece. I think a lot of people gravitate towards the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and I think, you know, those periods are fantastic. But there's something about Greece that you get romance, get um, like I've been reading Thucydides in the past 6 months or so, and it's like reading a book that is published 10 years ago, because it's so strikingly modern, and yet it's a book being written in, you know, BC about the Peloponnesian War. So it's just fascinating because you can relate, you can get pieces where it's incredibly relatable to a Western reader, but at the same time, you also have, like, you know, the gods and Zeus and how he decides, oh, I want to, you know, screw with the people. And so we're going to do this. And it's, you know, it obviously didn't happen that way, but that's how they tell you about it. And that's all you've got. So it's fascinating. I love, you know, Alexander the Great, Philip II. They have some fascinating characters. So it's really fun reading about ancient Greece for me.
Do you have any favorite or very interesting like any period of not period but any historical story that you can tell?
Hooey. Well, there's one story where this is very recent, like the past few days I've been thinking about this. It's in the Civil War. There's a moment. So to broadly paint the picture, the Confederacy, when they get into the war, they're at a disadvantage from the get-go. And they realize, as part of their policy moving forward through the rest of the war, they have to get a European power on their side. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for them to win. And so they have ambassadors to Britain, to France, to Spain, lobbying for them to come in on the side of the Confederacy the duration of the war. There's a moment when a U.S. ship captures, or it comes across a British ship that has two Confederate ambassadors on the British ship. And the captain of the U.S. ship forcibly removes the Confederate commissioners to Britain from the British ship and imprisons them. And Britain takes great offense to this. And for a couple months, it's very touch and go. And Britain is debating heavily whether or not they're going to declare war on the United States and come into the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, which would have changed quite a bit. So ultimately, they didn't. They were talked off the edge, I guess. But there was a moment where it was very, very possible that Britain came in on the side of the Confederacy, it's been fascinating to just sort of think about what that might have meant. But the story itself is incredible, because in the moment when it happens, there's a lot of it kind of reads like a political thriller. If you go back and read some of the letters and the correspondence, and the two commissioners themselves are very excited about the fact that they've been taken off and put in prison, because they feel like that one American captain has done more for Confederate policy in Europe than they could have ever done by jumping the gun, I guess. So it's a very fascinating kind of moment.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting. Usually we hear about like US and USSR. So this is something new for me. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of those. Again, it's whenever you study something, you find way more than you think you're going to find, and it gets very convoluted. And all of your heroes kind of become less heroic than you thought they were, and all of your villains become less of a villain than you thought they were, and they kind of descend into this morally gray sort of area.
I mean, I definitely feel that history should have been uh, told to us in our schools more engaging and more interesting way, rather than just like, okay, this happened at this period of time, okay, this happened at this period of time. I mean, there is no
Yeah.
narrative between like why it happened, so what caused then, like, what are the things that happened before this. So I mean, definitely feel like history can be interesting if one is presenting with a more engaging narrative.
I have a working theory that the best teachers aren't necessarily better teachers than your teachers that weren't very good. It's just that they were excited. I think your very best history teachers are ones that get excited about the stuff they're teaching. Realistically, in a high school setting, you're not going to be able to do any subject justice because you have to jump through so many different things. But I think your best teachers are ones that get really excited and find ways to insert some of the cool aspects of history into, the subject. And I think what's somewhat difficult and why, well, it's just difficult about academia in general is that you go from like this very general historical approach that doesn't appreciate nuance all the time. You go to college and you get more nuance, but it's sort of this rote kind of way of teaching things. And maybe the professor is excited about the subject they're teaching, or maybe they've been teaching it for 30 years and they just don't care anymore. But you don't necessarily get that natural excitement unless they're excited about it. And then if you continue on, you go to your master's and you go to your PhD and you drill into it and you get so tight into the form and the rhythms of academia that it sort of loses its luster. It doesn't always, but it becomes less of a, oh, there's this really cool story and here's all the context and nuance around it. And it becomes much more about, how do you practice history correctly, which is incredibly important, but sometimes it can kind of take the shine off the narratives themselves. So I've got a working theory that your best history teachers are just the ones that were excited that maybe they drank a monster before coming into class that day.
Yeah, so in my school, there is one math teacher. So he used to be excited about everything except mathematics. So he used to tell so many stories about so many things, like be it biology or like history and everything. Apart from math, he used to tell us everything. He used to be excited about it. I think he should be the teacher of general knowledge rather than the
Yep.
mathematics.
Yeah, no, he sounds great.
Usual people ask you about favorite history books, and we will get to that. So what are the books that you find very worse that I mean, how people are consuming, you felt like, okay, how this book got published? I mean, maybe made because of misinformation or disinformation, or maybe because of the narratives, maybe because of the facts presented, maybe because it is off picture. What are the books that you think, that you felt while reading, that how did it get published?
Man, golly, that's tough. I don't know. I don't know if I have a really good, this is a terrible book example.
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm looking around my library trying to trying to find one.
Maybe you have read all good books, I think.
Well, selfishly, I think I do have a lot of good ones. I'm not sure. I do know, especially with history, you can get very into the nitty gritty about facts. And I think some books, it depends. Like different people read history books for different purposes. A historian is going to be looking for different things than, a general audience. I can't say that I've read a history book that was especially horrendous. I have read history books that don't necessarily paint things in what I think to be the correct way, but I don't think that makes them bad. Like, for example, there's a Southern writer, Shelby Foote, who wrote a trilogy about the Civil War. And there's nothing necessarily bad about the trilogy, but he is from Mississippi and he grew up in the early 90s. And so his view about the Civil War initially was very pro Southern. And he cooled on that as he got older, but he started his trilogy in the 90s, and still Southern sympathies in the 50s are not the accepted narrative now. And so you will find some very scathing reviews of his trilogy because he writes it from like with this sort of southern tinge to it, and he just there's no black people in there at all, so that's not great. But at the same time, there's things that he does exceptionally well. He breathes life into the narrative. He is a writer, and a very, very good one. And he's incredibly good with certain battles, like Fredericksburg. He writes the Battle of Fredericksburg he's incredible on that battle. So there's things he does well. There's also some things where it's like, you know, you kind of just bake that in. Like, he's not very good about this one thing, but many historians aren't great about certain things, and they bring bias and things like that. I've got a Substack post going out next week about the historian John Keegan, who is a fantastic military historian, but I have noticed that he's very bad on very specific things, like the Mongols, for example. He writes about them in an incredibly old-fashioned way, and he doesn't give them any credit for being tactically and strategically brilliant. So, you read a great military historian who can sometimes write the very best thing you've ever read about a certain military, or usually with him, it'll be something in World War II or in the Napoleonic Wars, or pretty much any time Britain is involved, because he's a British historian. He's very good on that subject. But when things get outside of that purview, when he's starting to write about, in this case, the Mongols or Persians, or things that are just not in the British sphere, he can miss. Sometimes he writes things and you just kind of take it with a grain of salt. Like, this is his writing of the Mongols is the very worst I've ever read. It's terrible. And if you read him writing the Mongols, you kind of just throw it out because it's bad. But he's also, in that same book where he's writing about the Mongols, he writes incredibly well about other subjects. So I don't know. You just kind of take it with a grain of salt.
What do you think about the mainstream history books? I mean, there is a book called, I think you're probably aware of it, The Sapiens, The History of Humankind. So what do you like? Have you read it, and what do you think of that book?
I don't think I have read that one. Who wrote that book?
Yuval Noah Harari, he's a famous Israeli author.
Okay. Sapiens. Here we go.
Yeah,
Yes.
Sapiens.
I've cracked this open. Harari. Yeah, I've cracked it open, but I have not read it all the way through.
I mean, it has some bias. So he's kind of
Okay.
like saying that, okay, British did a good thing invading India. So he said that, okay, British bought railways, and they also established universities and everything. So he's saying that he wouldn't think like India would have come up with these things if British weren't there back in those times.
Yeah, historians tend to do that. Well, and because if you look at the events in a purely analytical way, you can arrive at some conclusions like that. But if you kind of divorce the humanity from it, you can get there. And he, in very specific instances, he might be right. Like, maybe some of those things would not have happened. But it's also a situation where, would you rather have the advances that maybe you would have gotten because you were exposed to a Western superpower, or would you rather have the 3 million people that died? And you weigh that. And again, that's where the distance comes in, because if you're reading about ancient civilizations and you go, okay, well, they were responsible for the deaths of 300,000, 500,000 people, but also they mastered, I don't know, fill in the blank technology. Maybe they mastered, the domestication of horses or something. And so you have this broad human advancement that this civilization gives you, but also they killed a bunch of people. And so you have to weigh, it's very, very bad that they did this one thing, but also they did this thing that's really good for us. And, I think probably the historian is going to be divorced from that human way of seeing things, because they're just a historian. They look at the events and they look at the implications and things like this. And that's one way of doing it, but it's not the only way to do it. So it's very difficult to kind of get into, again, it's so hard to get into binaries, because you can look at things and you can be like, well, we got this advancement, but also you have terrible things, and you just sort of have to weigh it. Like, which would you rather have? And again, it depends on who you ask.
So it's about like you get everything, but at what cost?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then, is that cost worth it? And some people are going to give you one answer, and some people will give you a different one.
So we talked about so much of history, but the fundamental question is that what draws you towards history? So what is something you find it interesting that other people don't?
Yeah. I think it's, well, getting really deep into subjects is very fun because you get to uncover the things that you were not taught in school. The initial impetus for starting Compendium at all was I got really into Viking history, and there was so much there that's just not in school. It's a common thing. School teaches you a very simplistic view of history, and it doesn't ever give you the full story about anything. But when you study history, you get this fuller picture of things, and you get exposed to incredible individuals, and you get to see their exploits, but you also get to see the cost that they had to pay or people around them had to pay for them to get what they wanted. And it creates great drama. So history is in turns incredibly dramatic, but it kind of brings you into philosophy and psychology, and it touches every other subject because at its core, it's a study of humanity. So it's something we can all relate to. I'm naturally drawn to subjects where you're looking at how humans have reacted in incredibly adverse situations. I love seeing one, how people kind of arrive on the scene in history and, create things, but also how events kind of pull people along. And then also how, just sort of adding full color and context to the events that we've learned and seeing how people have, been incredibly resilient through difficult circumstances, and how things have changed because of, individuals kind of resilience through difficult circumstances. So it's kind of everything in one. History allows you to study pretty much anything you want to, which is really fun.
Before starting our podcast, we talked about immigration. So recently, there is so much of uproar towards immigration in America. So I have read somewhere, maybe it is Substack, I think. So it is kind of like a common sentiment among the First Nations in Canada and also Native Americans in America. They kind of say that okay, there is no such thing as immigrant in a stolen land. So it is essentially saying that so the British people or like French or these people who came here like massacred people and like stole the land from indigenous people. So they don't have right to say about immigration. So how do you so do you agree with it?
Well, there's a political question there, and there's a history question there. The political question is one that you can't win, so I'm going to try and stay away from it. But
Yeah.
in terms of history itself, no land anywhere is anybody's native land. Every piece of land from the dawn of time has been stolen from one people group by another people group. So if you want to follow that line of thinking to its logical conclusion, you would arrive, especially there's a lot of debate in America about Native Americans. And, if you want to say, okay, this piece of land in, we're going to say Nebraska, is Comanche native land or Sioux native land. Well, the Sioux or the Comanches stole it from somebody else. They may have stolen it from the Arapaho or the, fill in the blank, whatever tribe you want to kind of follow that all the way down to whoever had it first. But it was stolen over and over and over and over again. So it's one of those things where, in that sense, no land is anybody's original land. I mean, if you want to take all land to the very beginning, I mean, you have like the Euphrates Delta, where, you have a civilization that's then conquered by another civilization that's then conquered by another civilization. And then you get to where it's the Medes, and then the Medes are conquered by the Babylonians, and then the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians, and then the Persians are conquered by, well, you also have the Assyrians in there, and they're conquered by, and it just kind of goes one after the other. So, it's just one of those arguments where it's not entirely logical if you want to do it that way. But also, and you got to put in the caveat, there is the human element. You still have, especially in America, Native Americans kind of holding on to a heritage of their people where okay, we used to be fill in the blank. We used to be this way, and that way of life was stolen from us by the American government, which it was. There's really no way around it. I mean, they were conquered, and in the way of conquered peoples, they were subjugated and they were treated as an inferior people group. And this is unfortunately the rhythm of humanity since the dawn of time. Peoples have been conquered by other peoples over and over and over again, and they have been treated as lesser than by the group of people that have conquered them. So in that sense, are there any immigrants on stolen land? It's the actual historian's question, that part of the question there is we're probably talking about it in the wrong sense. If you want to have more of a political question about, what should immigrants and immigration look like, you might be having a different conversation, but that is a natural political question. If you just want to talk about stolen land and conquered peoples, and it's kind of a useless conversation, if we're being totally frank. And again, it sounds bad because that is the removing of the human element. And when you insert the human element into that conversation, it adds a different color to it. But if you want to speak broadly about this sort of thing, it's, in my mind, it is somewhat illogical.
So I will ask you the final question. What are what history books? Let's say that five history books you think like everyone should read.
Oh my gosh. So Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond is fascinating. What else? I really enjoy A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman. It's a history of the 14th century in the Middle Ages in Europe. What else? I have a lot of individual subjects books, and I am not the best source for the best history books ever written, but I have really enjoyed lately A Team of Rivals by Doris Goodwin. What else? I think Hanoi's War by Lin Hong Nguyen, a history of the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War, is excellent. It's probably, just in terms of a history book, the best single history book I've ever read, because it takes a subject that very little was known about prior to this book and illuminated a massive amount. And it wasn't written by an American, which is a plus. So we get an actual Vietnamese voice to kind of chime in on that, and it's it's great. She got access to archives to North Vietnamese archives that nobody had gotten access to. So it's a very protected information that she got access to. Let's see, what else?
One more book.
Yeah, man, I don't know. Maybe The Wolf Age by Tor Shaya, a history of the Vikings. It's very easy reading, but it was fascinating. I mean, it looks at all these great figures like Harold Bluetooth and Svein Forkbeard and, Thorkel the Tall, just all these heroic, I say with air quotes, figures. Fascinating book, and it's so easy to read. That's probably not the definitive top 5, but those books are really good.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Thank you for coming to my podcast. It's lovely talking with you. I mean, we should do some other episode some other day. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Appreciate you having me on.
it's too awesome talking with you. Thank you for joining. So for any one interested in history, like I will definitely recommend Compendium podcast by Josh. So I will be sharing links of his podcast in the description below. So if anyone interested, go and check it out. So thank
Thank
you,
you so
Josh.
much.
Thank you. Bye.
Awesome. Awesome.